There are men who spend their whole lives in a place and never learn it. And there are men who learn a place so well it eventually turns around and learns them back. The man this story is about was the second kind. He spent 41 years walking the floor of the Sonoran Desert. And when he finally sat down to talk about what he had seen, he asked for two things first: a cup of water and the lamp turned low. Before we go any further into the dust and the heat and the dry creosote, man, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? I mean the actual place, the room, the road, the kitchen, the truck cab. Drop it in the comments. I read those. It matters to me to know who is on the other end of this. And while you are down there, do me one favor. Look at the pinned comment and at the link in the description. I put together something called the Appalachian Dossier. It is a compilation of stories that were quietly scrubbed from official American records between 1843 and 1891. Not theories, not folklore that someone made up last Tuesday. Filed reports, field notes, sheriff's ledgers, all of it taken out of the public archive at some point and never put back. The dossier is the closest thing I have ever assembled to a paper trail of what this country does not want to remember. Pinned comment, link in the description. It will be there waiting after the story. Now, back to the desert. The man I am talking about went by Cuchillo Tafoya. That was not the name he was born with. He once said the name he was born with belonged to a child who did not survive a winter, and so he had not earned the right to use it anymore. Cuchillo was not Apache by blood. His mother was Yaqui, his father a Mexican muleteer who died of fever when Cuchillo was still a baby. But he had been raised from the age of 11 by a Chiricahua Apache scout named Sotelo, who took him in after the boy was found alone on the salt flats near the Pinacate. By 1887, the year these confessions were written down, Cuchillo was 41 years old, tall for his time, lean with the kind of leanness that comes from 40 years of eating one good meal a day and walking 30 miles between sunrise and sunset. His hair was already gray at the temples. He had a long, narrow face, sun, darkened to the color of saddle leather, and a small white scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw. He never explained that scar. People who tried to ask got the same answer every time, which was no answer at all. He worked in those years for a man called Joaquin Westover. Westover was a livestock agent out of Tucson, who had a contract with the army to recover horses and pack mules that had wandered off, been stolen, or been driven off by raids. The work paid badly. The work also took men into country that no one else wanted to enter. Cuchillo was the best tracker Westover ever hired, and Westover said as much in a deposition years later. He said Cuchillo could read the ground the way a priest reads a missal. He said Cuchillo could walk into a valley, stand still for a minute, and tell you how many men had passed through it in the last week, what direction they were going, and whether any of them were sick. Westover also said that toward the end of 1886, Cuchillo started refusing certain jobs. He would take work in the north. He would take work in the east, up toward the Galiuro Mountains. He would not take work in the country south and west of a place called Quitobaquito Springs. That was a stretch of desert that ran from the springs down across the border into Sonora and out to the lava fields of the Pinacate, about 4,000 square miles, give or take, of the driest, hottest, emptiest land in North America. Cuchillo had grown up in that country. He knew it better than any living man, and after the autumn of 1886, he would not set foot in it. Westover pressed him on it once, offered to double his pay. Cuchillo refused. Westover asked him why, and this is where Cuchillo gave the answer, that the next year he would expand into the long confession that this story is built on. He said, "There is something out there that has been watching me my whole life, and I am too old now to keep pretending it is not. Now, before I go further, I want to tell you something about how this confession came to exist at all. In the spring of 1887, a Jesuit priest named Father Anselmo Rise was traveling through Arizona Territory on a mission from the Diocese of Sonora. He was collecting accounts from native trackers, vaqueros, and old prospectors about what he called, in his own notes, the spiritual geography of the borderlands. He wrote down what they told him, not to publish, not to sell, just to preserve. He met Cuchillo Tafoya in a small adobe house on the outskirts of Saseb in May of that year. They spoke for 3 nights in a row. The third night ran almost until dawn. Father Rise wrote everything down in a leather-bound notebook in a mixture of Spanish, Latin, and the kind of careful English he used when he wanted to make sure he had heard a man right. That notebook stayed in the diocesan archive in Hermosillo until a fire in 1948. Most of the notebook burned, but 42 pages survived because Father Rise had bound them separately in a smaller folio, and they were in a different room at the time. Those 42 pages are the source of what you are about to hear. I am telling it to you in my own words in plain English. But everything in this account comes from what Cuchillo Tafoya told that priest on those 3 nights in 1887. He started with the first time he saw it. He was 11 years old. This was the same year Sotelo had taken him in only a few months after. They were camped on the eastern edge of the lava field and in a place where the black rock gives way to a thin band of sand before the desert opens out into the long flats that run toward the Gulf. It was the dry season. The night was clear. Cuchillo said he had been lying on his back, looking up at the stars the way a boy will, and he had noticed that one part of the sky had no stars in it. Not a cloud, not a shadow. Just a part of the sky where the stars were missing in a tall, narrow shape, standing about 200 yards from the camp. He sat up. The shape did not move. It did not have edges he could see. It had only the absence of the stars behind it. He woke Sotelo. Sotelo looked once. Sotelo did not look twice. He told the boy to lie back down, to face the fire, and to keep his eyes on the coals until he was told otherwise. Cuchillo obeyed. He lay there for what felt like an hour with his eyes on the fire. He could feel, behind him, the shape, not see it, feel it. He said the feeling was like standing in a room when someone else has just walked in, except the someone else was already there and had been there for a long time and was only now letting you know. Eventually, Sotelo touched his shoulder and said it was gone. They did not speak of it again that night. But the next morning, before they broke camp, Sotelo did something Cuchillo had never seen him do. He took a small bone awl out of his pack and scratched a mark in the rock at the edge of the camp, a simple mark, 2 lines crossing with a 3rd line under them. Cuchillo asked what it was. Sotelo said, "It tells the next man who passes this way that the thing has been here." He said, "If you ever see this mark, do not camp at that place. Go on 3 more miles. Sleep on hard ground. Do not sleep on sand." Cuchillo asked, "What is the thing?" And Sotelo said in Apache, a phrase that translated roughly to the one who is not where it stands. He said, "In our language, the name means it is in the place where you are not looking." He said, "The place where you are looking is where it is not." Cuchillo carried that lesson for 30 years. He saw the mark, the 2 crossed lines and the 3rd underneath, in a dozen places across the Sonoran during his life. Sometimes scratched in stone, sometimes scratched in the wood of a fence post. Once, he said, he saw it cut into the dried hide of a dead steer, and the wound was so old that the leather had cured around the lines. He always obeyed it. He always slept on hard ground. He had been doing this work for a long time, and I want to pause here and ask you a small thing. Have you ever had a feeling on a perfectly normal evening that there was something in your home that should not have been? Not a sound, not a sight. Just the certainty that the air in one of your rooms was a degree off, and that if you walked into that room, you would understand why. Tell me about it in the comments. I am always struck by how many people have a version of that story, and how few of us ever say it out loud. Cuchillo's second sighting came when he was 19. He was hunting mule deer alone in the foothills west of the Babaquavari Range. He had been tracking a single buck for most of the morning and had finally cornered it in a small box canyon. He raised his rifle, and just as he was about to fire, the buck turned its head not toward him, but toward the opposite wall of the canyon. The deer froze. Cuchillo froze, too. He said, "You do not shoot a deer that has just noticed something more dangerous than you." He lowered his rifle very slowly. He looked at the canyon wall. He saw nothing. He looked back at the deer. The deer was still staring. And then, while he was watching, the deer simply fell over. It did not flinch. It did not stagger. It dropped the way a man drops when something cuts a string at the back of his neck. Cuchillo waited for almost an hour before he moved. When he finally walked over to the carcass, he found no wound, no blood, no mark on the hide. He turned the animal over twice. Nothing. He left the deer where it lay and walked out of the canyon. Halfway down the slope, he stopped and looked back. From that angle, he could see the canyon floor clearly. He could see the dead buck. And about 30 feet from the buck, he saw a long, narrow patch of sand where the ripples in the surface ran the wrong way, as if something had been standing there and the sand had settled around the shape of its weight. And then the shape had gone. Now, this is a man speaking, remember, who had spent his entire life reading ground. He could tell you the difference between a coyote print and a small dog's print at 20 paces. He could tell you if a horse had been walking lame 3 days before he found its tracks. So, when he said the ripples in the sand ran wrong, he meant it as a fact. He went back to his own camp that night and did not sleep. Around 300 in the morning, his fire began to do something he had never seen a fire do. It did not go out. The flames did not waver, but all the heat went out of it. He held his hand over the coals and felt nothing. The flame was still there. He could see it. There was simply no warmth inside it. He said it was as if the fire had become a picture of a fire. The cold lasted about as long as a man takes to slowly count to 100. Then the warmth returned all at once, the way the sun returns when a cloud moves off. He never camped in that part of the country again. He never went back for the deer. He told no one about it for the next 15 years. By the time he was in his 30s, Cuchillo had built kind of map in his head. Not a map of where the thing was, a map of where it was not. He had walked thousands of miles of that desert, and he had begun to notice that there were certain corridors of land where animals behaved normally, where the wind moved the way wind should move, where a man could sleep through the night and wake up rested. And then there were other corridors, sometimes only 100 yards wide, where everything was slightly wrong. The wind in those corridors did not match the wind on either side. Birds did not fly across them. Mule deer would walk for miles to go around them. Coyotes would not hunt in them, even when game was plentiful. He learned to recognize these corridors by feel before he could recognize them by sight. He said it was like walking out of a room into a hallway where the air pressure was different. Your ears noticed before your eyes did. He began to suspect somewhere in his late 20s that these corridors were not random. They formed a pattern. He started over the years to sketch the pattern in his head the way a man learns the streets of a city. By the time he met Father Rise in 1887, He had mapped mentally about 200 of these corridors across a stretch of country, roughly the size of the state of West Virginia. And here is the part of his confession that the priest underlined twice in his notebook. Cuchillo said the corridors moved. Not quickly, not in a single night, but year by year, decade by decade. The corridor shifted. The patch of ground that had felt wrong in 1865 would feel ordinary in 1875. And another patch of ground 3 miles east would have taken on the wrongness instead. He said, it was as if the thing did not occupy fixed places. It occupied a route, and the route was slowly, patiently walking. I want to take a breath here, because this is the story this channel was made for. Slow, careful, first-hand testimony from a man who spent his life paying attention. If you are with me this far, I want to ask you to do something simple. Hit subscribe. This is being narrated by Macabre Story. If you are enjoying the story and want more of this kind of careful primary source horror, the subscribe button is the only thing that tells the algorithm I am not shouting into a void. And if you happen to be hearing this on a channel that is not Macabre Story, then somebody has stolen this work without permission, and I would be grateful if you would report it. Thank you. Now, back to Cuchillo and the part of his life that finally broke him. In the winter of 1883, when Cuchillo was 37 years old, he was hired by Westover to find a string of 7 mules that had been driven off from a freight outfit operating out of Ajo. The mules had been taken at night by what the freighters assumed were Mexican raiders. The trail led south and west into the country Cuchillo would later refuse to enter. At that point, he still went. He took with him a younger tracker, a Tuano-O'odham man named Itoy Macario, who was 23 years old at the time. They picked up the trail of the mules about a day south of Ajo and followed it for 3 days. On the second day, they noticed that the prints of the mules were no longer being followed by the prints of any men. The raiders, whoever they were, had vanished. The mules were still walking south in a straight line. Not the kind of straight line a stray animal walks. The kind of straight line an animal walks when it is being led by a rope in a hand. Itoy wanted to turn back. Cuchillo overruled him. They kept following. On the third day, they came over a low rise and saw on the flat below the 7 mules. The mules were standing in a circle. Their heads were all pointed inward toward the center of the circle. They were not eating. They were not moving. They had been arranged. Cuchillo and Itoy watched the mules for almost an hour from the ridge. The animals did not shift. They did not stamp. They did not flick their tails. The sun moved across the sky, and the shadows of the mules moved across the ground, and the mules themselves did not move at all. Itoy began to pray quietly. Cuchillo did not pray. He took his field glass out of his saddlebag and looked through it at the center of the circle. He said in his confession that he could not at first see anything in the center. He said the center looked empty. He said he then made the mistake of looking very carefully, of letting his eye really settle. And when he did, he saw in the center of the circle what he could only describe as a place where the air was thicker. He said it was the shape of a tall, narrow figure. He said the figure had no edges. He said it had no features. He said it had only the suggestion of having a top where a head would be, and a bottom where feet would be, and a length in between. He said it was the same shape he had seen as a boy of 11 when the stars had been missing from one part of the sky. He lowered the field glass. He told Itoy very quietly that they were going to back away from the ridge. They were going to leave the mules. They were going to ride north for the rest of the daylight, and they were not going to stop, and they were not going to look back. They did all of those things about 2 hours after they left the ridge, while they were riding hard across the flats. Itoi began to scream. Cuchillo did not stop. He had been told what to do when a man begins to scream in that country, and what to do was keep riding. They reached water at sundown. Cuchillo got off his horse and walked back to Itoi, and Itoi was no longer screaming. Itoi was no longer doing anything. The younger man was sitting in his saddle, eyes open, breathing, but he was not present. Cuchillo waved his hand in front of Itoi's face. No reaction. He spoke Itoi's name. No reaction. He took a canteen and poured a little water over Itoi's head. Itoi blinked slowly, and then began to ride again in the same direction, mechanically, as if he had never stopped. They made camp that night. Cuchillo built a fire. Itoi sat across from the fire and stared into it without expression. Cuchillo asked him questions. Itoi did not answer. Cuchillo ate. Itoi did not eat. Around midnight, Itoi finally spoke. He said one sentence in his own language, which Cuchillo understood. He said, "It followed me back as far as the ridge, and then it stopped because we crossed a place where someone had marked the rocks." Cuchillo asked, "What marked the rocks?" Itoi said, "You did when you were a boy." Cuchillo did not remember marking any rocks anywhere as a boy. He had watched Sotelo do it many times. He had never done it himself. He stayed up the rest of the night staring at the dark beyond the firelight, trying to remember whether there had ever been a moment in his childhood when he had taken a bone awl and scratched 2 crossed lines with a 3rd line underneath, and he could not remember any such moment. They reached Ajo 3 days later. Itoi spoke normally by then. He claimed to have no memory of what had happened between the moment they saw the circle of mules and the moment they arrived at water. Cuchillo did not press him. Westover paid them. The mules were never recovered. The freight outfit wrote them off. 2 months later, in the early spring of 1884, Itoi Macario walked out of his own house in Cells at 300 in the morning in his night clothes and walked south. His wife saw him go. She called after him. He did not stop. He did not turn. His tracks led south out of town and into the desert and continued in a straight line, the kind of straight line that does not belong to a man walking on his own for almost 4 miles. And then the tracks ended. Not faded, not blown over. Ended as if he had stepped off the edge of something. A search party combed the country for 2 weeks. They never found him. They never found his night clothes. They never found so much as a footprint past the end of those 4 miles. Cuchillo, when he heard, did not go to Cells. He stayed in Tosin. He drank that week for the first time in his adult life. And then he stopped drinking, and he never started again. And he sat down and tried to think about what he had brought home with him from that ridge. Because that was what he believed. He believed he had brought something home. Not the figure itself. Cuchillo said the figure stayed in its country, in its corridors, in the part of the desert that belonged to it. He believed he had brought home an attention, a piece of having been noticed. He said it was the way a man feels for days after a stranger has stared at him on the road. The stranger is long gone. The look is still on you. For the next 2 years, he kept working, but he stayed north. He took jobs in the Galuros, in the Catalinas, up toward Tonta Basin. He did not go back to the South Country. And during those 2 years, he started to see, for the first time, the small mark of the 2 crossed lines and the line underneath in places he had been many times before and had never seen it. Old fence posts. The door frames of abandoned mining shacks, the rim of a stone well outside a roadhouse, where he had stopped 100 times. He swore in his confession that the marks had not been there before. He said he was a man who paid attention to things, and these marks had not existed in those places when he was younger, and now they did. And then in the autumn of 1886, he came home one evening to the small adobe room he rented from a widow in Tucson, and he found scratched into the inside of his own door, very faintly the same mark. 2 lines crossing. A 3rd line beneath. He did not own a bone awl. He did not own anything that could have made that mark. He had locked the door behind him that morning, and he had unlocked it that evening, and no one had been inside. He sat on the floor of his room and looked at the mark for a long time, and then he understood something, or he believed he understood something, and the understanding was this. The mark was not a warning that the thing had been there. The mark was a warning that the thing was watching that place, and someone all those years had been leaving the warnings behind for the people who would come later. Someone who knew where the thing's attention was. Someone who was tracking the tracker. Cuchillo said to Father Reyes that he believed Sotelo had been one of these people. He believed there were others. He had never met them. He did not know what they called themselves. He only knew that the marks kept appearing in country he had walked, in rooms he had locked, and that whoever was leaving them for his sake. He said, with what the priest described in his notes as a great calm, that he had decided he would no longer go into the South Country because he did not want to bring the attention back. He had brought it back once. He had lost Itoy Macario because of it. He would not do it again. He spent the last winter of his life in Tucson, drinking only water, going to early mass at the small mission on the edge of town, and walking every afternoon out to a particular ridge east of the city, where he would sit and watch the sun go down over the Tucson Mountains and the country beyond them. He told Father Reyes that he believed the thing was, in its slow, patient way, walking toward the city, not at him, not at any man, just walking. The way weather walks, the way a river finds its bed. He said its corridors had been moving north and east for as long as he had been mapping them. And at the rate they were moving, in another 40 or 50 years, they would reach the foothills, and in another 100, they would reach the city, and in another 200, they would reach country. He could not even imagine country, full of people who would have forgotten the marks and would not know what they were looking at, when the wind in one of their hallways did not match the wind in the next room. He said this without fear. He said, "It the way a man tells you the season is changing." Father Reyes asked him on the 3rd night what he believed the thing was. Cuchillo answered for a long time. The priest's notes on this part of the conversation are the most heavily annotated pages in the surviving folio. The short answer Cuchillo gave was this. He said, it was not a ghost because ghosts were the leftover shapes of people, and this had never been a person. He said it was not a demon because demons had purposes, and this had no purpose he could see. He said it was not an animal because animals could be tracked and understood, and this could not. He said the closest word he had for it in any of the 3 languages he spoke was the word the Apache had used, the one who is not where it stands. He said it was a thing that occupied the place where you were not looking. He said it lived in the corner of the eye. He said, when you turned to look, it had already moved 1 step further into your blind spot, and it would never, in this world or any other, stand still long enough for a man to see it directly. He said the only reason he had glimpsed it twice in his life was that he had been looking for something else and had caught it by accident the way a man catches the corner of a stranger's coat in a crowded room. He said he believed that everyone at some point in their life had probably seen it for half a second and looked away and convinced themselves it had been nothing. He said the difference between him and other men was only that he had been raised by Sotelo, and Sotelo had taught him to write down in the back of his mind every half second of strangeness and ever experienced and never to dismiss any of it. He said, if you wrote them all down in your own life, you would find a pattern too. He said the pattern would scare you. He said, this is why most people did not write them down. Father Rise asked finally, on that third night, what he should do with the confession. Cuchillo told him to keep it. He said he was not asking the priest to publish it, or to act on it, or to warn anyone. He said the warnings were already in the world. The marks were on the doors, and the stones, and the fence posts. The people who needed to see the warnings would see them. The people who did not see them were not going to be helped by a story in a book. He said he was telling the priest because he had carried it alone for 40 years, and he was tired. And he wanted one other person to know, before he died, that he had not imagined any of it. Father Rise wrote in the margin of that page a single line in Latin. Translated, it reads, I believed him. Cuchillo Tafoya died the following winter in February of 1888 of pneumonia. He was 42 years old. He was buried in the small Catholic cemetery on the south side of Tucson. His grave was unmarked at his own request. Father Rise returned to Hermosillo shortly after the burial, carrying the notebook. The 42 pages of the confession sat in the diocesan archive for 60 years before the fire. Now, I told you at the start that this story comes from those 42 surviving pages. That is true. But there is one more piece of paper that belongs to it, and I want to tell you about that piece of paper before I let you go. In 1951, 3 years after the fire in Hermosillo, a survey crew was running a new telephone line through a stretch of desert about 90 miles south of Tucson. They were laying poles. One of the workers, a man named Augustine Vaqueros, was digging the hole for the 7th pole of the day when his shovel struck stone. He cleared the dirt away and found that the stone was part of a small flat slab about the size of a dinner plate, buried 2 feet down. The slab had been buried deliberately, face up, and on its face someone had carved a mark, 2 lines crossing, a 3rd line beneath them. Augustine had no idea what it was. He showed it to his foreman. The foreman did not know either. They photographed it for the survey report, and then they left it in place and dug their pole hole 3 feet to the side. The photograph went into a county file in Pima County. It sat in that file for another 20 years. In 1973, a graduate student from the University of Arizona, going through old county records for an unrelated paper, came across the photograph and recognized the mark, a footnote, in a Jesuit history book. The footnote was a reference to the partially surviving Ray's confession. The student wrote a short article about the photograph and the mark and the confession. The article was published in a small academic journal that almost no one read. The article disappeared from view. The mark is still there. The pole is still there. If you stand in the right spot on a back road south of 3 Points and walk about a quarter-mile west, you can find the pole. And if you scrape away enough dirt at the base of it, you can find the slab. I have not been there. I know 2 people who have. They say the air on that quarter-mile of ground feels a degree off. They say their watches do not keep the same time on that walk as they do on the rest of the road. They say a person who is paying attention and who knows what to listen for can hear, very faintly, the sound of something walking slowly parallel to them on the other side of a small ridge that should be empty. They say the sound never comes from the same direction twice. They say, if you turn your head to look, the sound stops, and then after a little while it starts again somewhere, just outside your line of sight. That is where I am going to leave you tonight. With a slab in the ground, with a mark on a door, with an old tracker who lived past 40, in a country that killed most men by 30, because he knew where to step. With a younger man who walked out of his house one night and into a straight line, that ended 4 miles later in nothing. And with the slow, patient, decades-long movement of a thing that does not care whether you believe in it, because belief is not part of how it travels. I do not know what Cuchillo saw. I know that a Jesuit priest who had spent his life listening to men lie about smaller things believed every word of it and wrote so in the margin of his own private notebook in a language he did not expect anyone else to read. I know the marks are real because the photograph from Pima County is real and the slab is still there if you know where to look. I know the corridors he described would, by his own estimate, be reaching the foothills of the Tucson Mountains right about now. And I know that every so often in the news out of that part of the country, a hiker walks off a trail in good weather with full water in country they know well and is never found. Their tracks usually stop in a straight line, not a meandering one, a straight one, the way an animal walks when it is being led. I would like to know what you think. Have you ever been in a place where the wind in one corridor did not match the wind in the next? Have you ever caught for half a second in the corner of your eye something tall and narrow and without edges and turned to look and found yourself convincing yourself very quickly that it had been nothing? Tell me in the comments. Read the others while you are there. You will find more of you than you expected. And if you have not already, go to the description or the pinned comment and pick up the Appalachian dossier. The stories in there were quietly removed from the official record between 1843 and 1891. Cuchillo Tafoya's confession is not in the dossier because his confession was preserved by accident by a fire that should have destroyed it and did not, and so it survived where most testimony like his did not. The dossier is what we have of the rest. The accounts no fire spared. The names that did get scrubbed, stay with me for the next one. I will be here. And as for the thing in the corridors, somewhere south of Tucson tonight, walking the route it has been walking since before any of us were born. Cuchillo Tafoya is buried in an unmarked grave on the south side of that city. He chose the grave to be unmarked, he told the priest, for one reason and one reason only. He did not want to leave a place with his name on it. He did not want to be findable. He had spent 40 years learning how to be a man the thing in the desert could not follow home. And in the end, he wanted to die the same way he had lived, sleeping on hard ground out of the line of sight. Until next time, keep your eyes on the corners of your rooms tonight. And if you find yourself looking twice at a shape in the dark, remember the old tracker's rule. The place where you are looking is where it is not.